for The Sun, and Rachel Cunliffe is Senior Associate Editor of the New Statesman. Now, if you'd like to join in with the programme and ask our panel a question, the number to call 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, and, of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first call. It's from Bob, who's in Hemel Hempstead. Hello, Bob.
Hello, Ian. Yeah, last week we heard the government planning to spend some money, and part of the way they were going to fund it was from a £2 billion underspend from Michael Gove from housing, which absolutely staggered me. And I'd just like to ask the panel, if they had that £2 billion, how would they spend it on housing?
If you had £2 billion, how would you spend it on housing? It would be a nice house that you'd buy or build, wouldn't it? Jenny Chapman.
Oh, God. I mean, this is sort of in fantasy politics territory. I mean, we've got a big commitment about housing, about insulation, because we think that our housing stock is insufficiently insulated, and we'd like to spend money doing that if we could, if £2 billion were to fall from the sky, like it seems like it might have done for Michael Gove from what you've said. And, you know, it would help with this summer with keeping our houses cool, and it would help in the winter to keep our bills down. And we all know how much people are struggling with our bills. So I'm going to put a bid in to Rachel Reeves for insulation.
What would it cost? I don't know if you've got this number off the top of your head. Probably not.
Probably not.
I'll forgive you if you haven't. I mean, £2 billion would be just a sort of drop in the ocean, wouldn't it, in terms of insulating every house in Britain? Not that every house could be insulated, but for those that could, I imagine it would cost tens of billions.
Well, I hope I haven't disappointed anyone, but I don't know the answer to how much it would cost to insulate. I guess you wouldn't have to insulate every house, and there would be some houses you could do for more than others, and some people who'd be more than happy to pay for it themselves. So I don't know the number, but you've just given me £2 billion for free. So I'm insulating houses.
Very happy to do it.
There's loads of different things you could do with
Natasha.
that money. You could obviously put it on windows, you can put it on doors, you can, extra insulation within your walls. I'm looking at doing this, can you tell?
You do seem to be very well informed.
I'm very well informed. You actually stole my answer. As you were saying it, I thought insulation would definitely be a good thing to do. It will save everybody money down the long run. I agree with Jenny. Can I say that?
Victoria.
What about, first of all, I do agree, because it does reduce the bills. I mean, certainly in the local housing estates up in North Kensington, they're going through this whole window replacement, and everybody's now getting double glazing and new windows. And the advantage of that, of course, is it does, of course, reduce everyone's heating bills. But I also wondered whether we could use the money to put in more solar panels, to do more wind infrastructure. In other words, cut the... First of all, we're going to half the billion we're going to spend on the insulation. The second we're going to do on environmental matters.
Because, of course, putting solar panels on roofs is not cheap, is it? Is it about 10 or 11,000, I think, depending on the size of the house, I guess. But I can't divide 11,000 into 2 billion, but I suspect you wouldn't get that many houses done, a few thousand at any rate. Rachel?
Do we have to use this for making homes more efficient, which I agree with everyone else is a very, very worthy goal? Can we use some of it to simply build more houses and to build the infrastructure needed to support those homes, which is not a very conservative policy, or it sometimes is a conservative policy, but then other Conservatives go, yes, definitely do that, but not here. And actually Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens all do the same thing. And they all say, we'd love more homes here, but we can't have more homes here because we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the water, if you're talking about one of the Cambridge MPs today, we don't have the schools or the GPs or the parking facilities or the transport infrastructure. So, sorry, no homes here. And if you went, well, some of the money will be for homes, and some of the money will be for that infrastructure. Now, could we build something? They'd still all say no, but their argument would have a lot less weight.
But that is why you need Labour's housing strategy, because we absolutely recognise this issue where the Tories at the last election promised to build 300,000 homes every year.
They say they're still going to.
They've scrapped the housing targets, so I don't think that's consistent.
Would Labour put those housing targets back?
So we would put housing targets back in, and we would also reform the planning process, because we think that what you need, rather has just been said, isn't just to say we want X number of houses. It's to say we need that housing in a planned way with the appropriate infrastructure and with the involvement of local communities. So you have things like the right roads, you've got sufficient school places, you don't end up with the unplanned pressure on health services. And what you've got at the moment is a kind of incremental, piecemeal, unplanned development that goes on, which isn't really done in a way that reflects that any sort of housing need locally. I mean, I've seen this where I live, so I think that's why we want to have a much more planned approach.
But surely that's all to do with the appointment of Nick Boyce-Smith today in Create Streets. I mean, the point is that I do believe in the Create Streets motto. You know, this is building something that we all want to live in. And I think he called them enduring homes, working with the local councils. I mean, I believe they do believe in lifetime homes. They don't believe in overcrowding. They don't believe in building rabbit hutches that nobody wants to live in. They want a home that people actually genuinely wants to actually live in. You know, whatever it is, it has some sort of streetscape, it has some sort of beauty. I mean, I think some of the new builds are absolutely hideous.
Well, I live in one of those and I quite like it.
Well, that's excellent.
I mean, you know, quality does matter.
You live in a rabbit hutch?
I live in a new build house.
New build's good. Well, yes.
I'm very proud of my house and I love it very much. But that's not the point. The point is that it's not going to happen if we don't put the targets back in. And that's the experience has shown that, you know, these things don't happen unless you say to local authorities, you know, this is what we need. Those targets need to be agreed. I don't think that the way the government went about it previously with this kind of top-down formula that they wouldn't tell you what the formula was, so there was no challenge in the process. It does need to be understood and challengeable. But you've got to have a clear plan from the government, and local authorities need to know what they need to do.
But none of you have suggested spending Bob's £2 billion. He's such a generous guy, isn't he? None of you have suggested spending that on social housing, which, I mean, if you think about the number of council houses or housing association houses that there are now compared to 30, 40 years ago, surely that would be something that we could start with. Rachel?
I should say, I said build more houses.
Yes.
I didn't say that they weren't social housing, and actually it needs to be a mixture, and you need to get the balance right so you can provide housing for the most vulnerable, but you can also offer a step on the housing ladder for those who need it. And I say housing, like houses, I also mean flats and apartment blocks. I mean, yes, it's true, lots of people would, I guess, if all things being equal, not like to live in a rabbit hutch, but if it was a case of, not having that or being homeless or buying that property or being in the absolutely insane London rental market, I think a lot of people would choose that or would just like to have the option. And I think you're not going to solve Britain's housing crisis unless you build all kinds of homes everywhere. And if you take away the power of local residents, very, very small groups of local residents who are very, very vocal, who go to their local MP and say, we want you to block this. And then the local MP who has made wonderful speeches in the House of Commons about how important it is to get Britain building again and have growth and have enterprise in this country suddenly goes, absolutely do not build on this beautiful car park in the middle of my constituency. And then it doesn't happen.
But I mean, we've
Well
seen
said.
in London, you know, we need over 50,000 homes to be completed every year. And that is, and frankly, I think there's over 1 million people on the housing list in London. I mean, you know, actually, I think we probably need
How
more.
many were completed in each year that you were Deputy Mayor of London, Victoria?
Post-COVID, I can remember very little, but I'll be honest with you.
That's no excuse.
No, exactly. I can remember some years we made the target and some years we didn't. But, you know, the important thing is making a start. I mean, just like Sadiq is able to take some of the ones that Boris started, just like Boris was able to take some of the ones that Ken Livingstone started.
Very generous
So
of
I
you.
think, well, you know, that's the way it goes, because it takes at least 2 or 3 years to build a house. So even if Sadiq started all those 50,000 again now, they wouldn't be ready till the next mayor, which may or may well be Sadiq. But, you know, so the point is that, you know, building a house, this is why we need a long-term strategy. I think we have, just like we have around this table, we've seen some unity. We all know what the problem is. I don't think anybody around this table disputes the need to build the houses, and we know they've got to be affordable, they've got to be environmentally friendly. So actually, I would prefer to have some sort of policy here where we did all collectively agree the way forward.
Well, it's as if you knew what the next question was going to be when you mentioned Sadiq there, because, Bob, thank you for that. We have Hassan in Cambridge on the line. Hassan, what would you like to ask?
Hi there. Has Keir Starmer done another one of his U-turns on ULEZ, and is he pushing Sadiq Khan to withdraw or dilute one of his core policies in order to stand a better chance in the next mayoral elections?
Or you could say, has he thrown him under the bus? Because Keir Starmer specifically blamed Sadiq Khan's ULEZ expansion, due to go ahead in just over a month's time, for Labour losing the Uxbridge by-election. The Mayor's aides say he's open to new ideas for mitigating the impact on Londoners, but is refusing to budge on when the expansion goes ahead. Natasha Clark, I want your political antenna on this one. I think I was quite surprised how far Keir Starmer went in appearing to blame Sadiq Khan personally for this.
Yeah, I was too, actually, because obviously you'll remember in the run-up to this, Danny Beales, the candidate for Labour in Uxbridge, obviously went in on a platform essentially to campaign against ULEZ, which is a very interesting position for a Labour candidate going into campaign against his own mayor and against that policy. So it was a little bit of a backtrack from Keir to then go in and say, actually, yes, we did lose this by-election in part due to ULEZ, and obviously we know how close it was in the end, 400 votes in it. So the Conservatives are obviously claiming huge victory in this, but in reality it's a lot more complicated on the ground, and it's a very London-specific issue that we probably won't be seeing in the same way in a general election. I think what's probably happened here is that Keir Starmer has put a little bit of pressure on Sadiq Khan to say, look, is there anything you can do to mitigate the impact of this? I think Keir Starmer on the LBC a couple of weeks ago said that he would increase the amount of money being put into the scrappage schemes for cars that have to get rid of under the ULEZ thing. So I think that's obviously something that he would like the mayor to look at, and just look at whether there are other ways that can essentially mitigate the situation. And I think obviously that's what Sadiq's gone away to look at. But he seems to be standing firm as it is. Doesn't seem to be flip-flopping on it just yet.
Now, Rachel, you write for the New Statesman. I imagine your magazine will be all over this week.
Well, everyone in the New Statesman newsroom is just a bit confused by Labour's reaction to that by-election. I mean, no one denies that Labour were expecting to win it, or certainly hoping to win it. But as Natasha says, it's not a seat that you can really extrapolate sort of up and down the country. It's got very specific local issues, very specific demographics that actually make it harder for Labour to win than you might think, looking at London as a whole. It seems very obvious that ULEZ wasn't communicated very well, that a lot of people thought they would be liable for this charge who wouldn't be. 9 in 10 cars, TfL estimate, would be ULEZ compliant, so wouldn't be impacted by this. And it's quite clear that a lot of people in Uxbridge voted thinking that they might have to pay it. So one, that's a communication failure. But two, if you look at London polling as a whole, it's actually vaguely popular, more popular than unpopular. The London mayoral election is a London-wide election. The fact that some people in constituencies on the outskirts of London aren't too keen on it, I mean, that's a bitter pill for Labour to swallow, but it doesn't tell you very much about the London elections as a whole. It certainly doesn't tell you very much about the country as a whole. And I think if they could get their communication and their messaging right, this wouldn't be as much of an issue for them. And it's particularly stupid, but to have made this internal row over ULEZ the focal point of the post-by-election coverage, when Labour could have been talking about non-stop overturning a 20,000 majority up in Selby, and how the Conservatives really struggled in Selby and in Somerton. Instead, it's all become about Labour's internal wranglings over a policy that broadly won't hurt them that much in the general election.
Jenny Chapman.
Sorry, Jenny.
Thank you. No, that's quite all right. I mean, I worked for Sadiq for a while as well, so I know both Keir and Sadiq fairly well. And what I think this tells you about Keir is, one, that he likes to win, and he's serious about winning back those voters, and some of them who didn't vote Labour last week in Uxbridge. He's very, very pleased with our performance in Selby, and you rightly highlight that. We did overturn a 20,000 Tory majority.
But you
and
couldn't
that was-
manage a 7,000 one.
Well, every seat is different. Every seat is unique, and there were factors in Uxbridge. ULEZ was a factor. Every candidate will tell you that. Everybody who knocked doors there will tell you that. So I think for the Labour Party to just close its ears and pretend that isn't what happened would also show that Keir Starmer, the fact that he's not doing that shows it not just does he want to win, but he wants to listen too.
Was it wise to pick a bit of a fight with Sadiq though?
I mean, they're not fighting. They'll have a discussion about it, and there will be different views, and they will come to the right solution. You don't tell Sadiq what to do; he is the mayor.
What is the right solution?
But you are able to say to him, I think that it's okay now to look at this, and I think that's all that's happened.
What is the right solution?
I'm from Darlington. I do not know what the right solution is. I know that a lot of people are completely obsessed with London politics, and this does not affect the people where I live one little bit. But
it may be not
so
in
I'm
Darlington,
not going to
but
interfere with my own solution.
These schemes are being rolled out across the country, so it's not just London that affects.
I mean, they're being rolled out because of the 2014 Clean Air Act, which was brought in by David Cameron. And actually, it's a health measure. It's to reduce air pollution. And most people are really keen on that. If there's a way of doing it which doesn't impose what I think to a lot of people would be a serious strain on their household budgets with the £12.50 charge, then we should look at that way of doing it, because I think we do have the cost of living crisis now that we probably didn't have when these schemes were first conceived. And the pressure that people have...
You misremember. Don't you remember Ed Miliband's cost of living crisis campaign in 2015?
I think he coined the term, actually.
He did, yeah.
Yes. So what's your point? I don't understand what
you were saying when this was in first thought
when
back in 2014.
When the Clean Air Act came in, I mean, I don't think that we foresaw things like the budget of last autumn and mortgage rates being at 6%. Like they are now. I mean, I think that...
So it's you either believe in clean air or you don't.
Well, I think you do believe in clean air.
Well, you must do, because you were the one that introduced this back in the day under Boris Johnson, weren't you?
If there are ways of achieving what we want to achieve for the health, mainly of our children, in cities like London, without putting that cost onto household budgets, then surely we ought to do that, given the economic situation we're in now.
Victoria, let's come to you.
Just a real quickie. I personally believe that it is absolutely right to clean up London's air, but I don't think you need to have this extension. I mean, we have it in the centre because that's where anybody who's crazy enough to drive in London knows that we still have the traffic. But what I would do is I would not do the extension, and I think that's the problem, because I think at the moment
So people in Westminster can have clean air, but people in Hillingdon can't?
Because actually London is cleaner than it was anyway, and actually if you look at the air pollution figures, they're not as bad in outer London. So I mean, yes, at some point when we do continue to decarbonise the cars, that's absolutely right. But at the moment, it's not as... we're already seeing cleaner air in the outer donut, as it's called anyway. So I don't think it's necessary to enforce an additional cost of living.
But there are still people dying because of unclean air.
Yes, but there's a whole range
outer
of things that go into clean air. Buildings, we talked about in other environmental issues in buildings, other exhausts. It's not just cars that are causing pollution. And that's the point. I think we need a more holistic view as to what we need to do. But I think it's absolutely wrong to impose extra costs on people in August, in a month's time. So, yes, we've got to go for the clean air, but I don't think we need to impose the outer, in the outer.
Right, we've got to call it a day on that one there. I'm sorry, Jenny, but we're already running very, very late.
I was just going to refer to Grant Shapps' letter to the mayor,
you just have then.
instructing him to do this.
OK. Right, it's 8:20. We'll take more of your questions in just a moment on Cross Question here on LBC.
LBC.
Water.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
With us in the studio for Cross Question this evening, Jenny Chapman, Labour peer and Shadow Cabinet Office Minister, Victoria Borwick, who was Deputy Mayor of London under Boris Johnson, former Conservative MP, and now runs the Thames Estuary Partnership. Now, does that say what it does on the tin? What do you actually do?
Well, it's all about environmental matters. We're currently doing the refresh of the Thames Estuary strategy, so that's working with the PLA, the Port of London Authority, working obviously with City Hall, with Sadiq's environmental team. It's all about regeneration, getting more jobs on the Thames, but while you're doing all of that, making sure we think about environmental considerations. I mean, fortunately, the Thames is a great success story of the last 20, 30, 40 years. If you think back to what the Thames was like, as you know, we will now see fish, so we do fish surveys and things like that for people who are interested, and we make sure that if you're building a lock or something across a Thames estuary or tributary, that actually there's somewhere for the fish to get through and do their spawning. So it's a whole range of really interesting environmental things. Basically, we don't want to stop the regeneration and the work that everybody needs all the way down the estuary and all the houses and jobs and things we're all going to do, but it's all about making sure we have some environmental thoughts on that at the same time.
And also with us, Natasha Clark, Chief Political Correspondent for The Sun. Don't need to explain what you do we?
No, we don't. We do this. I just write it down.
We don't want to know how the sausages are made.
No,
Rachel Cunliffe is Senior Associate Editor of the New Statesman. Right, let's go to another question. It's a text question. No name left on this one. Do put your names on, please. Should Labour have done better in the by-elections? Victoria.
Well, of course, let's talk about Uxbridge, where we had a great local council.
Answer the question. We've covered that.
OK. I think it was quite obvious that if you go to the north, that the Conservatives didn't come out and vote. And I think that's the real story for the Conservatives. The Conservatives have to say, why did our voters not come out and vote? And I think if I was Rishi, I would be sitting down and saying, OK, what are we not getting over? What are we not delivering? That means that our supporters didn't come out and vote. It'd be interesting to see what happens in a general election whenever we have that. But I'm sad to think that the Conservatives stayed at home.
And they did stay at home in large numbers. Was it 36,000 down to 11,000, something like that? So 2/3 of Tory voters didn't go out and vote, but they didn't, or not many of them, switch directly to Labour. Jenny Chapman, is that? I mean, you won that seat, and it was actually, I think, the second biggest swing that Labour have ever had in a by-election. So you can't say that was a bad result for Labour at all.
I was not going to say that it was a bad result.
I'm sure you weren't. But does it worry you that Conservative voters who stayed at home didn't actually come out and vote for you, generally?
No. I mean, I think it was an astonishing result, really. I couldn't believe it. I was there campaigning and I could sense that we were getting support from places you wouldn't expect, that Conservative voters were very angry with the government and felt very let down and did want change. And the result just exceeded anybody's expectations. You know, to come away with a 4,000 majority in a seat that had a 20,000 Tory majority that we'd never held, you know, true blue Rishi Sunak's backyard, it was quite something. But to go back to the question, which was, should Labour have done better? I think the mood in the Labour Party is we're very pleased with how we did, but we do want to do better. So that's why we're focused a little bit, probably a little bit too much if you're just thinking about how to spin things on Uxbridge. But actually, I think that's right. I think it's right that we try and understand what it is that we still need to do, because no one in the Labour Party is running around saying, great, we've got everything just where we want it, let's just stand still till the election comes. You know, we want to work hard, we want to understand better.
In a perverse sort of way, is a good thing for Labour, isn't it? Because if you'd won Uxbridge with a 20,000 majority, I think there would be a lot of people thinking, right, the election's done then.
Well, they'd still have been wrong, but I think actually it's quite good for the party to understand that we've still got lots of work to do before the election comes. We knew that anyway. We're prepared for it. We're excited to do that. It's sleeves rolled up time is where we are. So that's why there is a little bit of work going into working, you know, to understanding and listening to voters in Uxbridge to find out, you know, why we couldn't get another 300 of them to vote Labour. I mean, that number sounds very small when you put it like that, but it's vital that political parties don't just rest on their laurels and say that was a good night and forget to do the hard work.
Right, let's go into our two commentators, pundits, journalists, call them what you will, for some independent thought on this. Rachel, let's start with you.
I think that if you're looking for someone who should be panicking about this set of election results, you're looking at Rishi Sunak, because the message of it really was that voters will vote for the anti-Tory candidate, whoever that may be. And in Selby, that was Labour, and in Somerton Froome, that was the Lib Dems. And that's a really interesting result as well, that there was a lot of talk before going into this election about will there be tactical voting and how much will tactical voting make a difference. The Lib Dems managed to overturn a 19,000 majority, and because it was so obvious that it was a race between the Tories and the Lib Dems, Labour actually came fifth in that. And I don't think that's a problem for Labour.
Their vote went down from, I think, 8,000 to 1,000. So it's proof that was happening.
But it's proof that it's working. And if you kind of map that onto the country as a whole, and you look at seats where the Conservatives are vulnerable not just to Labour but to the Lib Dems, and by the way, in Somerton and Froome they did switch from Tories to the Lib Dems. There were people who were not just staying at home but actually switched their vote.
It had been a Lib Dem seat, hadn't it?
It had been a Lib Dem seat, and it's an area that the Lib Dems kind of have been historically strong in, and it's definitely one of Ed Davies' target areas. But if you map that onto sort of the national map, it starts to look very scary for the Conservatives indeed. And it's not clear what soul-searching, what policies they can come up with in the next sort of 12 to 18 months that will manage to fix that decline in both places like Selby and places like Somerton. And as we said, Uxbridge is a bit of an anomaly because of where it is in that local issue, and in London in general, the picture is very different. So I would be panicking if I were Rishi Sunak. He doesn't seem to be, but maybe he's in denial, I don't know. Natasha?
I think he went to see Barbie at the weekend, didn't he?
He did. He's obviously got
but
more
then he
important
said,
things on his mind.
But then he said he was going to take his children, who are 12 and 14, to Oppenheimer, and
That's a little bit dark.
That is not going to. It's got a really explicit sex scene.
3 hours
in
long
it
as well.
Yeah. So
honestly, why do they keep making? Anyway, that's another question. Natasha.
Another question. To be fair to you, Rachel, I do agree with quite a lot of what you just said. I think it is obviously Rishi Sunak that does need to be the most worried about this. But there are glimmers of hope for the Conservative Party in some of these elections. Not least that actually the idea that actually if you campaign against something, sometimes that is enough to get your Tory voters out, especially in Uxbridge. So I think there will be a lot of searching in the Conservative Party about, OK, so, it tends to be the traditional politicking that positive campaigning is usually the way to go, and we want to offer this hope and vision. But actually, the Conservatives showed in Uxbridge that it isn't always like that. And if there is something that, there is a genuine concern that voters did have about ULEZ and did have about driving their cars and environmental policies, and we've seen it in Westminster this week. It's now set hairs running. The Conservatives are looking at lots of environmental policies, looking at net zero, looking at the car ban. Sounds like everything at the moment is up for grabs. The zero emission mandate for cars that we're meant to be seeing in a couple of weeks' time. Everything is now on the on the table again. And I think the Conservatives will be looking at that and going, okay, is this unpopular? Is it popular? Can we use this? Can we not? So yeah, I think that there are opportunities that the Conservatives can bring out of this campaign.
Isn't it interesting to speculate what might have happened had the one politician who was capable of articulating positive, dare I say, boosterish visions had fought that by-election? Because Boris Johnson couldn't have fought it on ULEZ, could he, given that he introduced it? That's might be one of the great what-ifs of history.
No, right? He only brought it in central London.
I know.
And on environmentalism as well. Because obviously Boris Johnson was very, compared to many Conservatives, very good on the environment and had a better, strong environment.
Right, very interesting question coming up. So we'll go to the news first. It's 8:31 news headlines with Tim Daly.
Tourists on the Greek island of Rhodes are facing another night on makeshift beds after being evacuated from hotels in the path of wildfires and thick smoke. TUI is cancelling all outgoing flights for the next few days. Jet2 has done the same. A health minister says it's disappointing nearly 68,000 hospital appointments and procedures in England had to be rescheduled because of last week's consultants' strike. Thousands of senior doctors walked out for 2 days in a row over pay. And the Islamist preacher Anjem Chowdhury has appeared in court charged with 3 terror offences. The 56-year-old from Ilford in East London is accused of being a member of a banned organisation. LBC weather, sharp showers tonight for northwestern Scotland and a few light showers for parts of southern England as well. Clear elsewhere with a low of 7 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:34 on LBC. If you've just tuned in, it's Cross Question with Baroness Jenny Chapman, Labour peer and Shadow Cabinet Office Minister Victoria Borwick, who's chair of the environmental charity the Thames Estuary Partnership, former Conservative MP and Deputy Mayor of London. Natasha Clark is Chief Political Correspondent for The Sun, and Rachel Cunliffe, Senior Associate Editor of The New Statesman. Natasha, I always say that political journalists on tabloid newspapers have the most difficult job of anybody, because you have to condense a complicated argument into maybe 80, 120 words, whereas your broadsheet colleagues have hundreds of words. I mean, is it a knack that you learn?
Yes, definitely. Like, I came from City AM and from the Times to the Sun, so it was a very different style. And it definitely took me a long time to sort of figure out how to sort of flare your language and really concise it down. And even still, now we look at, our intros and look at it and go, no, that can be cut down, that can be cut down. You really have to read it a couple of times, and it definitely is a skill that takes a little bit of time to...
Because I noticed that you've given the shortest answers of all the panellists
tonight. Is that so?
Which means that you will be invited back.
Great. Anytime.
Not that you all won't either, I have to say.
Short, snappy, concise. That's what the readers want.
Dig myself out of this one. Stephen is in East Grinstead. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, good evening to you, Ian, and your guests. Has Johnny Mercer, the Minister for Veterans Affairs, now confirmed he has nothing in between his ears when using various media outlets and platforms to belittle and demean political opponents and celebrity mathematicians who oppose or question his politics?
Well, let me explain the background to this. Johnny Mercer responded to 25-year-old Keir Mather's victory in Selby by warning that politics mustn't become a repeat of the in-betweeners. I've heard of worse political insults than that, I have to say. Also, it's actually Johnny Mercer's wife, Felicity Cornelius Mercer, who's been involved in countless social media arguments with Carol Vorderman, who seems to... No, I won't say it. Right, who should we say? I'll start with Rachel, because I forgot to reintroduce you just now. Apologies for that. Rachel is Senior Associate Editor of The New Statesman.
Oh, I just feel that the hypocrisy of this, you just have to laugh at it, because I don't remember Johnny Mercer complaining at all when Sarah Britwell or Deanna Davison, ages 24 and 25 respectively, were elected in 2019. I don't know, maybe he thinks girls are more mature than boys. Maybe they are. But I think it's good to get young people of all parties involved in politics and involved in Parliament. And actually, we started off this conversation talking about housing. A third of my generation, millennials, won't be able to afford a house. And it does seem like every party wants to tax us more in order to protect the triple-locked pensions of the over 65s, some of whom obviously need it, but many of whom have enjoyed huge housing wealth over the last couple of decades. And maybe if we had more young MPs, people who were renters rather than owning their own homes, or landlords, I think you've got more landlord MPs in Parliament than you have renter MPs, maybe we'd have better policies, maybe we'd have better green policies, maybe we'd have, a bit of an eye to the future. So I don't really know what Johnny Mercer is talking about, and I think he should look at his hypocrisy and maybe rethink.
Jenny?
I mean, I think he was wrong to say it, and I told him so at the time.
Because you spent the night with him, didn't you?
Well, excuse me.
Really want to distance myself from that comment, Ian.
You want to deny that comment, not distance yourself.
Well, deny it completely, yeah.
We should explain. You spent the night touring
with you
the
also,
studios.
Ian. Yes.
Indeed.
That's probably made it worse, actually.
Yeah.
Back to the topic. He was wrong to say it. It was just a stupid thing to say. And I told him he was wrong, and we had a little bit of back and forth about it. But, I think it is right that we've got a range of ages and experience in Parliament. Keir Mather is fantastic. What he's achieved at 25 is tremendous, and it's a credit to him. And I think...
What has he achieved?
He's got himself elected. He's just defeated.
Yeah, but before that?
He'd been to Oxford University, which I think is a pretty good achievement. I've not been to Oxford University. I don't know if you have.
I haven't,
but I find that quite an impressive achievement. So he's going to be a really good champion for his area. He led a fantastic campaign, and those things don't happen by accident. He did a really good job, and being the candidate in a by-election like that is a tough thing to do. He handled himself impeccably. I think he's going to be a real addition to the Commons. I'm very pleased that he's there.
But what's good for the goose is good for the gander, isn't it? Because there's been a lot of criticism over the last few days about the appointments of Ross Kemsell and Charlotte Owens to the House of Lords, who are, I think, 29 and 31. Obviously, Keir Mather was elected, they were appointed, but a lot of the comment has been about their age and lack of experience. I mean, isn't there a slight bit of hypocrisy there as well?
Well, I think the controversy around the appointments to the House of Lords were more about Boris Johnson and his the way that he went about that, and the way there was controversy about the whole list. I think that's a bit of a different issue, if you don't mind me saying so. I think no one's really... if it had just been age, I think you'd be having a different conversation. But I think following the Lebedev appointment as well, I just think there's a sort of nasty smell about some of the ways that Boris Johnson went about appointing people to the House of Lords, and then the way that there was such a sort of tussle over it, with Sunak sort of giving in and Nigel Adams then walking out. Nadine Dorries, God knows what she's doing. Is she leaving? Is she staying? And I just think the whole thing has really tainted politics. And so I think it's more about that than it is about age.
But can I just say, as a previous MP, the vast majority of people who you meet, obviously at your weekly surgeries, do need you to have some life experience. They absolutely have gone through the rental, or they haven't got a house, or they've got mice, or they've got rats, or they've got damp, or they're living in terrible conditions. Or there's crises facing their lives, they're not getting their benefits, or the range of things that come before you may not be even things that you absolutely have control over. But I think they often appreciated the fact that somebody sitting there had some life experience. So I do think it's not that I'm certainly welcome Zara, Mary and the new Keir, and I think that's absolutely right. But I do think from the public's point of view, they're also looking for people who they can relate to. And the vast majority of people who come, with their children, with their problems, unpack their lives in front of you with their carrier bags full of problems, which they tip out in front of you and say, help me now, which absolutely I went to public service to do, and I'm still helping people. And I think, in a way, people want to work with people who they feel will have empathy with them, who they will relate to, people who know, well, it doesn't matter what party they voted for or what their problem was. You're there as their MP to try and help their problem.
But OK, you might not have had huge amounts of life experience at the age of 25. That doesn't mean to say that you can't handle these problems.
No,
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that generally I think people would appreciate.
But the point, I mean, I was an MP for 10 years too, and I recognise completely what you're saying, but my experience of Keir Mather is that he has that maturity.
Right.
And I hate to break it to everybody, but there are some MPs, and I think Johnny Mercer may have proved himself to be one of them, who lack some of that maturity some of the time. And it's not always about age. Sometimes it's about character.
And sometimes also it's about experience. So age doesn't necessarily equal experience. If you've got an MP like Rishi Sunak, I've got no idea how he was as a local MP, but nothing in his life suggested he would have direct experience of dealing with the benefit system or dealing with a sort of privately rented home that was full of rats or black mould. And I don't think for a moment that he wouldn't be able to handle those problems as a constituency MP. He's probably got a bit more on his mind now that he's Prime Minister, but he wouldn't have had those direct experiences. And I don't think age necessarily is the key marker for can you empathise with somebody's problems.
I mean, we'll look at Sarah Backcliffe.
Natasha,
about her earlier.
I remember I applied to go on the Tory candidates list, I think, when I was 24.
What were you thinking?
Well, quite. And they didn't actually turn me down, but they said, come back in a few years. And they were absolutely right to do that in my case. Whereas I think there are people at the age of 24, 25, 26 who may well be capable of doing a really good job as an MP. But I know that I would have been much better if I was 40, or dare I say even 60, of doing a good job as an MP than I would have been at 24.
Yeah, I agree. When I got one of my first jobs as jealous, I had no idea what I was doing. We all pretend that we do, and I think, men specifically are much better at doing this than us women, aren't we? We're all much better, they're much better at just sort of blagging it, fake it till you make it.
Do you think so?
Definitely, absolutely. I think they must teach you guys something.
With the exception of Liz Truss.
Yes, she definitely had that fake it till you make it attitude, didn't she? Exactly. But yes, no, I do think, there's a balance to be struck. But obviously the Conservative Party shouldn't be sort of belittling younger candidates, because they're exactly the type of people that they should be trying to woo over. And it obviously is nice when you are a young person, and I'm not sure if I'm a young person anymore. I might be tipping towards the middle. What is that called? It's not even middle age, is it?
Well, I'm not going to ask how old you are.
What's between a young person and a middle age?
I think you qualify as young. That definitely qualifies as young.
Well, I think when I'm looking at who to vote, so sorry. When I'm looking at who to vote for, I do think that it's nice to have that empathy and somebody that does understand the problems that you're facing. But equally, like I say, you do want them to have some experience, and you want them to have that confidence that you can, if you went to them with a problem, they would know how to sort it out. So there is that balance. But yes, the Conservatives should not be belittling younger people just because they they have different views to them.
I think the only other point to make about this is that actually the Labour Party didn't choose Keir Mather to be the MP for Selby. The people of Selby did. They knew how old he was. They knew who he was. They'd heard him speak up. It was a by-election. You can't escape the contest. They made that choice. And what I found about Johnny's comments was not just being disrespectful to young people, but actually disrespectful of the democratic process and the choice that those people in Selby had made in full knowledge of Keir's age.
Just finally on this, do you think Keir Mather's mother did him any favours when she
I think she's ace.
defended him the next day?
What's she supposed to do?
Don't you have a go at my lad?
Yeah, well, you don't mess with a Yorkshire mam if you've got any sense, right?
I love it.
I'll bear that in mind. It's 9:15.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Jenny Chapman, Victoria Borwick, Natasha Clark and Rachel Cunliffe with me answering your questions. The next one comes from Ben in Clacton. Ben, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, Iain. Good evening, panel. My question is, are Rishi Sunak's green policies in tatters?
Well, the Prime Minister said today that he is committed to reaching net zero by 2050, but says any new green measures must be proportionate and pragmatic. The mood music, certainly from the Prime Minister, is, should we say, somewhat less equivocal on the environment than maybe Boris Johnson or David Cameron certainly were. Victoria, let's come to you first, as you're sitting there in your nice green suit.
Well, I personally think the environment's all important, and that we have to find ways of making this work. I mean, there's no point pretending that, you know, as the half of the Europe is on fire, that there isn't a problem with.
I'm sure that one Greek island counts as half of Europe is on fire, but
okay, that's a bit unfair. But when you look at the temperature map, it doesn't seem to be rather. I think that's where we all need to not go on our holidays where it's all on fire.
But what about Rishi Sunak's commitment to green policies?
I personally think that we do have to look at it, but we maybe have to look at it over a longer period of time. We haven't
got a longer period of time.
No, but I hope that he is sitting there looking at what we can do. I mean, I would go on using our resources in the North Sea. I wouldn't stop those licences. We've got to look at investing in nuclear. We've got to look at. I'm disappointed we're not going to go ahead with a wind farm in the North Sea. I think we've got to look at going on. Bringing in more environmental measures in order that we can get out of the traditional power.
But are you concerned at all by the fact that he does seem more equivocal on this than his predecessors?
I think he appreciates.
David Cameron actually got it, didn't he?
Yep, and I think Boris got it. And I think Boris actually, thought that the environment was really important. He may have been egged on by Carrie, but I think
his father.
But I think that, and I think most sensible people in the country appreciate how important tackling the environmental problems are. But we have to be able to afford them,
but
and therefore
he seems to be indicating that he doesn't think there are many votes in it.
Well, you see, I think it depends what age group you're going for. Because actually, I think the environment is much more important. If you were asking what I'd put on, my leaflet 10 years ago, so to speak, I'm not sure I would necessarily have included the environment. But if I was standing for political office now, you'd been mad not to talk about the environment, in my view.
Okay.
And certainly, in an inner city, tackling in the environment and air quality is all important. But you see, I'm not a great fan of electric cars because I think we're realising now the pollution in building electric cars, the pollution they're making on the roads, the pollution they're doing from the tyre wear. I mean, I think there's a lot more. I think the things that we're being pushed into doing, which aren't necessarily the right environmental choices.
Well, you're speaking to someone who ditched his electric car and went back to a diesel.
Well,
Natasha.
may I commend you?
You won't be able to do that forever, you know. You've not got long.
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure this 2020 thing isn't going to be changed.
New petrol cars are so much more
efficient. Clean petrol, that's the way forward.
Yeah, that's the way.
Natasha.
I think, going back to your point about Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, obviously Boris Johnson had the much easier job of creating policy and then not being around to implement it. And I think we're going to see this in the next sort of 10 to 20 years. Theresa May set this net zero target, made it legally binding, and is now not in power to essentially see it through, which is arguably the harder part of the whole thing. And obviously, when we talk about the environment, actually, we talk about lots of different things. We've already been talking about insulation. We talk about electric cars. We talk about boilers. We talk about other sort of natural environment, sort of DEFRA-related policies, plastics, and protecting our natural green spaces. There's lots and lots of different parts of the environment. Obviously, for a voter, we saw it with you, Les. Lots of people really do care about the environment, but then during a cost of living crisis, do they want to pay for it? Of course not. It's just not a priority for people at the moment. And obviously the increased weather, we saw it last year with the 40-degree summer, has really heightened the sort of consequences of what happens when we do have extreme weather and we do have extreme heat. So it's fresh in people's minds, but 6 months later down the line, people have forgotten about it all the time, and they're thinking about their mortgages, they're thinking about how to pay their bills. What they don't want is for them to be told, okay, you've got to buy an electric car, you've got to change your boiler, it's going to cost you lots and lots of money. So the government really do need to be taking people with them on this journey, and need to be saying, okay, look, we all need to pull in to do this, but the government are going to put in the money. Private investors, companies should be putting in the funding. It should not be the poorest households that have to pay for net zero. And if you look at government reports, there are about 250,000 people that are going to be worse off from net zero than they are going to be better off. And those are the people the government need to be targeting to try and make this right.
OK, Jenny Chapman, at least Rishi Sunak hasn't said he hates tree huggers, I suppose.
Well, I think the thing with Rishi Sunak is he's just not that interested in this agenda. And I think I'm slightly worried that one of the conclusions that the government is reaching because of the vote in Uxbridge on ultra-low emission zones is that therefore the public is somehow against an agenda that would protect the planet and is geared towards net zero. And I just think that's wrong. I think there are people who voted against ULEZ who are deeply concerned about the environment. They just didn't feel that they were in a position to pay the £12.50. And I think it'd be a real mistake for the government to turn its back on this agenda. I think it means an awful lot to people, but it's beyond that, isn't it? I mean, it's a responsibility. If you're in government, you've got a responsibility to do what's right for the country. And actually, the future of our prosperity as a nation, and this is the conclusion I think other countries are coming to as well, is about net zero, and it's about moving our energy supply in a greener direction. Other countries are doing it. It's the world is decarbonising when they can, and I just think it would be such a mistake for the Tories to. And politically, yes, it may be beneficial for the Labour Party if they just retreat into their sort of Tory comfort zone, but actually I think it'd be the wrong thing for the country. And there's jobs in this.
Remember, it is the Conservative Party, which means you conserve things.
They don't have to be the worst version of themselves every day, do they? And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the worst version of the Tory Party that I think I've ever seen.
Two more questions before we finish. This is from Alice in Manchester. Why is Matty Healy getting so much abuse for standing up for the right thing? Hands up, who knows who Matty Healy is? 1, 2...
As of this morning.
3. Victoria, you're looking a bit mystified. Let me explain. He's the lead singer of the 1975 group, and he's caused a storm while on stage in Malaysia by criticising the country's new homophobic laws and kissing one of his fellow band members. The festival he was performing at was then cancelled, and he's faced criticism for potentially triggering a homophobic backlash and then leaving the country. I should say we're going to be talking about this over the next hour on LBC, where I will be interviewing a Malaysian drag queen. Get me.
You have all the fun.
I do. Yeah. Natasha, let's come to you first.
Is Matty Healy still with Taylor Swift? What's happened there?
Oh, was he ever with Taylor Swift?
I think he was.
I know he's Denise Welsh's son.
Sorry, this is obviously not the question you asked. I think it was, obviously completely agree with him in his right to say whatever on earth he wants, but I don't think he should be too surprised that some of Southeast Asia have extremely strict homosexuality laws, which I think date back to when
But he
they were a
seems to
British
have
Empire.
offended a lot of the LGBT community in Malaysia as well by sort of saying this, and it's actually made their life worse.
Exactly, it's harming their cause, and I think there are a lot of people probably standing up and say, well, it's great for you, you've got that platform to stand up and if you want to use that to do so, fair enough. But actually, there's a lot of us that are really tough on the ground, really struggling, to sort of live our lives the way we want to, and it's not a very helpful comment.
Jenny,
I mean, I would defend very much a musician's right to shock and to cause offence, and to get himself into these kind of situations. It's, I think if that's how he wants to express his view, he probably was quite aware of what the consequences would be and decided to do it anyway.
I think the fact is he was very drunk when he said it.
Well, interesting. Didn't know that fact.
Yeah.
But, all the same, I mean, there's a very long and I think healthy tradition of performers getting themselves in these kinds of scrapes, and I think it's part of what makes the world go round. It's got a debate going. I don't claim to speak for an LGBT person in Southeast Asia and how they might feel about that, and if they feel differently, then obviously I would be interested in hearing about that. But he's a performer. he was performing, he wanted to make a point, that's his right.
Rachel.
I think he made it about him, actually, in the way that he did it. And obviously he has the right to say that. You might think that he would have looked at what the rules were before getting there and being suddenly shocked. And yeah, it's right to draw attention to it, but the story is now kind of more about him than it is about Malaysia's march towards LGBT equality, although we are talking about it. I'm really confused as to why the shows in Indonesia and Taiwan especially also got cancelled, because homosexuality isn't illegal in either of those countries, and Taiwan has actually been a leader in gay rights in the region. So not really sure what's going on there, but I imagine what was going on in his head was, I can get some headlines, and he did.
Victoria.
Yeah. Well, I'm a bit confused here. I mean, I'm also of the fact that I can only think it was a moment of madness at the end to complete the finale of his show.
No, it wasn't. I think it was only about half an hour in. So it was quite something to do. But according to reports, he was well leathered, as the phrase goes. Right, our final text question for the end, which is from George in Reading. Twitter became X today. There must be a better name for it than that. What would you change Twitter's name to, Victoria?
Well, I think I'd just have to change the image to perhaps people chatting over the garden wall.
Natasha?
I love that. I'm a little bit biased. I used to work for Twitter myself, so I'm going to keep it Twitter. But I still like the idea that Twitter is that you can talk to anybody, you can send a message, you can, have a conversation with people. So I still stand by that.
So you're very well qualified to be an MP because you work for Twitter, you've worked for City AM, you've worked for The Times, and you now work...
I will pass.
You're talking yourself into it. Jenny?
Well, Natasha mentioned the famous David Cameron quote about Twitter, where we were chatting earlier.
Too many tweets make her...
So I can't get out of my head
in
now
20 seconds I can say the word because it'll be 9 o'clock, so just keep going.
Well, I can't get out of my head changing the I to an A.
Rachel.
I'm with Natasha. I'd keep it at Twitter as a globally
People
renowned
know what it
brand.
is, don't they?
Everyone knew
Everyone
what it
knows
was.
it.
Yeah.
He's changed it to
Right.
a single letter which you can't trademark and makes it look like a sleazy dating site for married people. And the only reason he's done it is because he's had the
familiar with
idea.
those sites, Rachel?
I am actually.
Are you?
But he's wanted to do this since 1999 when he founded X.com. He's got this mad idea that X is the internet and he can be the internet, and it's completely delusional. And I'm going to rebel by insisting on calling it Twitter.
Well said.
Well said.
I can't wait to read your
You could call
column
it
on this.
Threads.
Oh yeah, I have a column on this coming out tomorrow, so
Well, we shall
stay
read
tuned.
that with great interest. Jenny, Victoria, Natasha and Rachel, thank you very much
Thank
indeed
you.
for joining us this evening on Cross Question. Well, coming up in a moment, I am going to be talking to a Malaysian drag queen because we're going to spend the next hour talking about the fact that the 1975 had cancelled 2 performances in Indonesia and Taiwan after a Malaysian music festival was curtailed when Matty Healy, their frontman and son of Denise Welsh, made pro-LGBT comments and kissed a bandmate on stage. Now, people are saying that this is all a bit that he shouldn't have done it because people should just sort of let people live how they want to in other countries. We shouldn't interfere in their legal system. But I wonder whether some of you might think, well, it's good for celebrities to speak out against restrictive and discriminatory laws wherever they are.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, more holiday companies are cancelling flights to the Greek island of Rhodes.